David Benatar argues that bringing children into existence is morally wrong, because coming into existence is a serious harm, and it's always better not to be born. With the arguments he provided, it seems he put himself into a nasty bind, and the choice will be difficult. Benatar identified 4 basic asymmetries in our moral intuitions, which he wants to explain through an underlying asymmetry regarding the values of harms and benefits. The upshot of his asymmetry is the conclusion that not being born has advantages over life, but existence has no advantages over never existing. This means that we're harmed by coming into existence. But how much? We usually think of our lives as being pretty good, but that is a mistake due to psychological mechanisms which make us see our lives with rose-tinted glasses. Benatar says that when taken objectively, our lives are very bad. So, coming into existence constitutes a serious harm. But even though our lives are very bad, we cannot conclude that we should kill ourselves, because once we're alive, we have a vested interest in the continuation of our lives. In this essay, I intend to show that Benatar is forced to choose, either admit that our lives are worth starting, or concede that our lives are not worth continuing. I will leave the detailed descriptions of all 4 basic asymmetries for the appendix. Here, the main idea behind them should suffice. Benatar claims we would all agree to some fundamental asymmetrical moral intuitions. We should regret bringing into existence a miserable child, but we cannot regret not bringing into existence a happy child for his own sake. Moreover, we have a duty to avoid bringing such miserable people into the world, but we have no duties to bring here happy people. The above-mentioned asymmetries in moral intuitions are said to be explained by Benatar's more fundamental asymmetry. Feel free to skip ahead if you're already familiar with it. Very briefly, Benatar presents his asymmetry of values like so. Whereas the presence of bad and good are perfectly symmetrical, the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good, the asymmetry shows up when we consider the absence of these. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, but the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. The comparisons can be put into a table. In the table we have scenario A on the left side, which is about already existing people like you and me. Here, presence of harm is bad. Feeling pain is worse than not being in pain. And the presence of benefit is good. Having a benefit is better than not having it. On the right side we have scenario B, and here we are considering a potential child, one that could have been conceived. For this person, who never was, absence of harm is good. It's better for him not to exist rather than to exist and suffer. And finally, the absence of benefit is simply not bad. This person does not exist, so he's not missing out on any pleasures or goods. The upshot of this fundamental asymmetry is that existence has no advantages over non-existence, but non-existence has advantages over existence, and that coming into existence is always a harm. Benatar does argue that our lives are objectively bad, with more bad than good, and there are no good lives. He lists a whole slew of negative things that befall us, from daily discomfort, allergies, headaches, shame, boredom, to cancer and bereavement. He says, even the best lives, contrary to popular opinion, ultimately contain more bad than good. And while some lives are better than others, none are non-comparatively or objectively good. When we combine all of the above, we have to conclude, Benatar says, that coming into existence constitutes a serious harm, and procreation is morally wrong in all cases. Since Benatar would argue that actually our lives are much, much worse than we thought, our lives could even be just as bad as those miserable lives we regret creating and have a duty not to create. Here's the thing, if our lives were indeed so bad, then Benatar could rely only on this idea and those rather uncontroversial basic asymmetries. Then you could say all lives are miserable and we have a duty not to create miserable lives, so we have a duty not to procreate. It would be a simple argument and no convoluted comparisons between scenarios of existing and never existing would be needed. At one point, he anticipates the trivial criticism encapsulated in the "why don't you kill yourself then?" question. He counters by saying that there are huge differences between starting a life and continuing a life. The threshold for judging that a life is not worth living should be much lower for someone who does not exist, because there is no one there to be deprived of any potential future goods. But once we're alive, we have our projects, plans, goals, memories, connections with other people, and agency to express our choices and our will. We have an interest in our lives. So, the argument goes, we don't have it bad enough to say that it's not worth it to continue to live. But wait, not bad enough? If we really have those benefits that are valuable and make our lives worth living, then surely we're not living the lives discussed in the four basic asymmetries or in the quality of life arguments. That is, our lives are not regrettable, and there was no duty to not bring us into existence. This means that the axiological asymmetry misses the mark, as it is supposed to function as an explanation of those basic asymmetries, which aren't applicable to our normal lives. If our lives are worth continuing, this goes against Benatar's arguments, which were supposed to show that our lives are objectively bad, really bad, which was supposed to support the claim that not only it wasn't worth it to start our lives, but that we've been seriously harmed by bringing us into existence. But since our lives are worth continuing, they aren't that bad, and we haven't been seriously harmed by procreation. The above admission that our lives aren't that bad, but are worth living further, shows that the conclusion of the axiological asymmetry is false. That is, because our lives are worth living, then clearly our existence has advantages over non-existence. In other words, our entire lives have advantages over us not existing. Despite particular isolated aspects of our lives being worse than if we were not to exist. If our existence has advantages over non-existence when we actually exist, then it would have to be like that even before we existed, or even if we never existed. Benatar counters this by arguing for optimism bias. He says that there are certain psychological mechanisms that prevent us from seeing our lives clearly, that bias us strongly to see good things in our lives, neglect bad things, and judge our lives as overall good. So, he says, we should not rely on our own evaluation of the quality of our own lives because they are tainted by subjective elements, but instead we should rely on impartial, objective assessment. If we take Benatar's arguments that the quality of our lives is objectively really poor, then we should be pushed to conclude that objectively it's not worth it to continue to live. Now, Benatar would respond that once we're alive, we have a vested interest in continuing to live. But all of those interests are merely our subjective views. They belong to the same category of biases coming from our unreliable judgment. If that were the case, Benatar would have to say that our lives are objectively not worth living, that is, not worth continuing. We merely think our lives are good enough and worth continuing because we are ignorant and deluded. But in fact, our lives are objectively miserable and hence not worth continuing. And that is a conclusion I'm sure Benatar would not accept. So Benatar faces a choice between two horns. He either agrees that our lives are objectively not worth continuing because our lives are very bad, or he accepts that our subjective values make life worth living and worth starting, and that we were not seriously harmed by our coming into existence. All in all, Benatar on the one hand argues that all of our lives are objectively really poor and we're mistaken in our judgment of our lives as good. On the other hand, he says that it's worth continuing to live because we have an interest in our lives. But our interest in continuing to live belongs to that same category of biases which make us wrongly see our lives as good. He cannot eat the cookie and have it too. He's presented with a dilemma and he must choose. He can either say that our lives are objectively really miserable and hence not worth continuing, or he can say that our lives are worth continuing, which means that our lives are not objectively so bad and we haven't been seriously harmed by bringing us into existence, which would mean that there was no duty not to bring us into existence.